Hello, this is video lecture number 98. Today we are looking at reform and reaction in the 1970s. Our subsections are civil rights in a new era, the women's movement and gay rights, and finally the Supreme Court and the rights revolution. So in a memorandum to President Nixon in 1970, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a policy advisor for Democrats and Republican presidents, noted that during the 1960s, the status of African Americans was the central domestic political issue. The civil rights movement had brought about real social change, which was reflected in the country's politics and culture. And while non-legal or de facto segregation would remain a fixture of American life, indeed some communities would become even more segregated over time. There was virtually no serious movement to reinstate Jim Crow laws. Legal or de jure segregation was dead. After the tumult of the 60s, the protests, demonstrations, marches, riots, vandalism, and looting, many wanted a return to order. Looking forward, Moynihan suggested treating the subject of race relations with benign neglect, believing that heated racial rhetoric was provoking extremism on every side and getting in the way of, if not preventing, the government's efforts to bring about an orderly transition from a segregated to a desegregated or post-segregated society. If the status of African Americans was the central domestic issue of the 60s, the status of women would become no less urgent in the following decade. And whereas in 1970, African Americans were a distinct minority and made up only 11% of the population, 60% lived in the central cities of metropolitan areas rather than in the suburbs. Women, on the other hand, made up half of the entire population. Thus, few in society were not affected directly by the impact of women's changing roles and expectations. In many respects, these changes have occurred as a result of modernization. Enormous changes in a society's economic and political structure. And similarities exist between the changing status of women in the United States and in other parts of the world, such as in Europe and Japan. But if the causes of change were similar, the reactions to these changes differed around the world, sometimes markedly, based on religion, culture, and many other factors. In the United States, the politics of feminists tended to be liberal, in part because many leaders drew inspiration from the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. In fact, a great deal of the early energy of the women's movement would be spent on a civil rights struggle to amend the Constitution, which proved unsuccessful. The politics of anti-feminists, on the other hand, were largely conservative, in part because they were motivated to defend the family as society's central institution. These facts influenced how the Democratic and Republican parties would work to appeal to voters and divide the electorate, a process that contributed to the sense that the country was engaged in a growing cultural war. So let's dive in and have a closer look with our first subsection, civil rights in a new era. Among the most significant efforts to address the legacy of exclusion against minorities and women was affirmative action. Affirmative action, however, did not sit well with many whites who felt that the deck was being stacked against them. Much of the dissent came from conservative groups that had opposed civil rights all along. They charged affirmative action advocates with reverse discrimination. Now, a major shift in affirmative action policy came in 1978. Alan Back, a white man, sued the University of California at Davis Medical School for rejecting him in favor of less qualified minority groups. Back versus University of California upheld affirmative action, but rejected a quota system, and thereby called the whole program into question. Further court rulings and state referenda in the 1990s and 2000s would further limit affirmative action. Another major civil rights objective, desegregating schools, produced even more controversy and fireworks. Where schools remained highly segregated, the courts endorsed the strategy of busing students to achieve integration. In some, black children rode buses from their neighborhoods to attend previously all-white schools. In others, white children were bused to black or Latino neighborhoods. In the North, where segregated schooling arose from suburban residential patterns, busing orders proved less effective. Post-war suburbanization had produced in the North what law had mandated in the South, which was segregated schools. Our next section then is the women's movement and gay rights. Much of women's liberation activism focused on the female body. The women's health movement founded dozens of medical clinics, encouraged women to become physicians, and educated millions of women about their bodies. To reform anti-abortion laws, activists pushed for remedies in more than 30 state legislatures. Women's liberationists founded the anti-rape movement, established rape crisis centers around the nation, and lobbied state legislatures and Congress to reform rape laws. Buoyed by this flourishing of activism, the women's movement renewed the fight for an Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, to the Constitution. Congress adopted the amendment in 1972, and within just 2 years, 34 of the required 38 states had ratified it, and the ERA had appeared headed for adoption. Now, credit for putting the brakes on ERA ratification goes chiefly to a remarkable woman named Phyllis Schlafly. She was a lawyer, long active in conservative causes. Now, despite her own flourishing career, Schlafly and her organization, Stop ERA, advocated traditional roles for women. The women's movement had another major goal also, and that was winning reproductive rights. Activists pursued two tracks, legislative and judicial. In the early 1960s, abortion was illegal in virtually every state. A decade later, a handful of states, such as New York, Hawaii, California, and Colorado, adopted laws making legal abortions easier to obtain. The judicial track culminated in Roe v. Wade in 1973. In that landmark decision, the justices nullified a Texas law that prohibited abortion under any circumstances, even when the woman's health was at risk, and laid out a new national standard. Abortions performed during the first trimester were protected by the right of privacy. Now, for the women's movement, Roe v. Wade represented a triumph. For evangelical and fundamental Christians, for Catholics, and conservatives generally, it was a bitter pill. Roe polarized what was already a sharply divided public and mobilized conservatives to seek a Supreme Court reversal limitation of abortion rights. The gay rights movement had achieved notable victories as well. These too proved controversial. No one embodied the combination of gay liberation and hard-nosed politics better than a San Francisco camera shop owner named Harvey Milk. Milk managed to mobilize the gay vote into a powerful bloc and finally won a city supervisor seat in 1977. After he helped to win passage of a gay rights ordinance in San Francisco, he was assassinated, along with the city's mayor, George Moscone, by a disgruntled former supervisor named Dan White. Okay, let's move on to the Supreme Court and the rights revolution. After Brown v. Board of Education from 1954, the court increasingly agreed to hear human rights and civil liberties cases. This shift was led by Earl Warren, appointed Chief Justice in 1953 by Eisenhower. The Warren Court lasted from 1954 until 1969 and established some of the most far-reaching liberal jurisprudence in U.S. history. Right-wing activists detested the Warren Court, accusing its decisions of contributing to social breakdown and rising crime rates. President Nixon came into the presidency promising to appoint conservative-minded justices to the bench. Between 1969 and 1972, he was able to appoint 4 new justices to the Supreme Court, including the new Chief Justice, Warren Burger. However, the Burger Court refused to scale back the liberal precedents set under Warren. Other decisions then advanced women's rights. In 1976, the court ruled that arbitrary distinctions based on gender in the workplace and other arenas were unconstitutional. And in 1986, they ruled that sexual harassment violated the Civil Rights Act. In all of their rulings on privacy rights, however, both the Warren and Burger courts confined their decisions to heterosexuals. The justices were reluctant to move ahead of public attitudes towards homosexuality. Okay, so this does conclude our video lecture for today. Go ahead and answer your review questions at this time and continue on with your work.